Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the weekly MMA Cycles Market Update. Today is Wednesday, the 5th of February, 2025. I'm Gianni DePoce, your host, and we are joined this week by the one and only Margo Amala. Margo, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. How are you?
Well, I'm doing great as well, and it's great to have you back on the show. We got a lot to talk about. Pretty interesting start to the year. A lot of intense geocosmic activity, and I know there is much more coming down the pipeline. So we have a lot to talk about today, and I'm looking forward to it. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. We're going to start off by looking at stocks. We started this week coming off of a conjunction between Venus and Neptune in Pisces. And it's interesting because, you have Venus in the last few degrees of Pisces here. She's exalted there. Going to be going into Aries. Well, in Aries now, as of yesterday, Jupiter went direct as well. But then Venus is going to be going retrograde here in a couple of weeks, and then going to be retrograding back into Pisces. So what's your take on what's happening in stocks right now? Do you think we have more upside, or are we in for more of the what I'm calling tariff tantrums that we've experienced over the last couple of weeks?
That's a great terminology. You know, I, the where I'm with the U.S. equity markets is I've kind of been avoiding them for the last week or two. I traded them to the upside off the lows back in early January, but I am feeling like what with the nasdaq in a squeeze, and the Dow Jones had this huge move down, and then now this huge move back up. I've been feeling a little bit uneasy in the U.S. equity market because we know we have Venus retrograde coming on March 1st. I have tracked a pattern that is correlated to a hotspot on the geocentric natal chart of the New York Stock Exchange, which is 2 degrees Aries.
Oh.
And whenever any planet passes over it, we get a reaction. But what's unique about what's happening during this Venus retrograde period is that Venus is going to pass back and forth over 2 degrees Aries multiple times. So the first pass is going to be this Friday, February 7th, and it actually happens at 5:52 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then the second event is on March 4th, which is a Sunday. So we'd look for reactions on Friday or Monday. And then on May 5th again, which is also a Sunday. So the last time these events happened was in 2017, 2009, and 2001. And basically there's a pattern that happens. There's typically a range that's created as we move into the event. And then typically within 3 days of Venus being conjunct 2 degrees Aries, we get a strong break. And that break leads to 13 to 27 days of directional move. So 2 of the events were downside. 1 of the events was upside. So that kind of gives us the possibility for either here, and a lot of our Neptunian hysteria moves have been to the upside in the last year, I would say. Right. So certainly that is possible. And a lot of my work on time cycle turns, I do a lot of planetary calculations to find weekly pivots. They have indicated that there's a pivot in the markets either last week or this week. And so that could be a consolidation pivot that we're seeing in the further range, but it also could be a pivot high. So that is basically what I've got on kind of on the lookout for the next period of time in the equities. I think trading the break of this range is really what's on deck.
Yeah, that's actually really wise advice. Is a lot of traders like to say get chopped up in the chop, and when you start to build these ranges, people are always trying to front run the breakout higher, or trying to sell the before it breaks lower, only for it to rebound. But going into next week, we have Mars trine Saturn, and then Sun opposite Uranus, and whenever Uranus is aspected, the possibility of a break out of a range does increase. But that being said, Margo, I do prefer to see consolidations like we have here in the nasdaq. I mean, you can see how we've been sideways for basically a couple of weeks here, few weeks. Mm-hmm. I like to see them last a little bit longer. So, but Uranus has a disproportionate impact on the nasdaq too, because it rules tech, and a lot of amazing things have happened in tech with the whole AI thing and DeepSeek, and kind of forcing us here in the States to rethink whether that AI trend is sustainable in the market because that's driven so much of what's happened in tech. But I mentioned this, I've been talking about this recently too. I kind of like what's been happening in the software space, and it's making me wonder if we've reached the point where all the AI advancements finally gets put to work in improving software, improving the existing technology, because a lot of the stocks in the software space have been beaten down pretty hard, and that's a pretty big sector in tech. Tech's such a big sector; it's so important for the U.S. But that's what I've been looking at too. So really interesting when you bring up those timing of those pivots. Venus retrograde, obviously one of the strongest planets to coincide with reversals in the market. So that's great. You want to jump over to bonds real quick?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay, I'm going to use TLT as a proxy. We're seeing a big move
Yep.
on that today. Nice gap up and run higher. So what are you looking at in the bond space here?
Well, so I was tracking that pivot low. I had that measured. And my next pivot high that I have coming in on TLT is the week of February 19th. And that's plus or minus 1 week. And my calculations indicate that we're in a bearish 20-week cycle right now in bonds. And so that I have that low by my calculations. Did I write it down? I might not have written down the 20. Oh, the 20-week. Sorry about that. I'd have to pull it up real quick. But
Is it the one from November you're going off of, that being the low, the previous low?
yeah, I'm going off the low from November 11th. There we go. So I have the low coming in on bonds the week of March 31st, 2025. And bonds tend to run a long cycle, I've noticed. And it's a little bit erratic. So like the last one was 29 weeks, and the one before that was 28. And the one before that, well, they're long. So anyway, that gives it a little bit of a wider orb on bonds, but I don't see a lot of upside potential past February 19th, at least in this current cycle.
It's so interesting what's happened in bonds. When we were together in Slovenia back in September, the Fed had just cut rates for the first time, and it led to a big sell-off in long-term bonds, which is really unusual to see. But when I think of the geocosmics of the situation, whenever I think of bonds, obviously Pluto rules debt, but I think of, Jupiter stimulus, Saturn contraction, and you had the first of 3 Jupiter-Saturn squares back in August, and then we had the second in December. So what's interesting is you had the Fed panic and cut rates 50 basis points, so 0.5% the first cut, about a month after the first Jupiter-Saturn square. And then back at the December meeting, they kind of pumped the brakes, which was within a week of the second Jupiter-Saturn square. And they're like, oh, we might not be cutting rates as much as we thought. And then now, if you look at what the market is expecting for the next Fed rate cut, we're looking at June or July. That's what the market's expectation is now. And that can change, obviously, but that lines up with the third and final Jupiter-Saturn square. So I find that really interesting when it comes to, interest rates and bonds. But yeah, it definitely is an interesting market right now because, you've had inflationary pressures come down quite a bit. And I know you want to talk about crude oil, and we'll jump into that next because it ties into bonds so much. But I think right now, this is the low that we need to watch very carefully, is this low from January. That's kind of the line in the sand. You start to take that out to the downside, I think you're going to see that bearish scenario play out that you're talking about.
Yeah, I agree. And, even if we could hold that low and still just kind of,
Drift.
put in a higher low or a double bottom even here as we move into the low of that 20-week cycle. I use the time trade software, and there's an AI forecast built into that. And it doesn't look super good for the kind of on the longer term, but those forecasts change as we go. So I agree with you that is a major level of support right
Let's
there.
jump to crude oil now, because that fits into the puzzle as well. And we've seen quite a sell-off here over the last couple of weeks. Now, there's so many factors that go in. There's geopolitical, there's changing domestic policy, a lot of things at hand. But when it comes to the geocosmics and the astrology behind it, we look at Jupiter and Neptune. So anything that is on your radar for the astro behind oil, or is there another planetary aspect or combination that is on your radar for this market?
Yeah, well, right now, so my forecast is that we can actually expect a range to continue, and a daily range, a tightening daily range through March 23rd. And that would be we're very close to the Venus Cazimi, the Sun Venus conjunction. And then when we begin Venus interval 1, things might shift, but I haven't fully made a forecast for that yet, but it does look like we might have a little bit of upside after that. Saturn transiting Pisces has been really restrictive. It's kept oil range bound on the monthly. And Saturn makes its first ingress into Aries on May 24th, 2025. But then it's going to pass back and forth until February 13th, 2026. And during that time, we're going to also be seeing the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. And from the heliocentric perspective, we get only one Saturn-Neptune conjunction, whereas from the geocentric perspective, we're going to have that dance back and forth over 1 degree Aries. But the Helio-Saturn-Neptune conjunction occurs on the 12th of December, 2025 at 1 degree and 14 minutes Aries. So overall, what I've found in the crude oil markets is that the most tradable setup from a geocosmic perspective is Neptune declination. And so if you go back and look at the chart, it was actually the exact week of the peak southern declination that Neptune made a weekly trend change, or oil made a weekly trend change back in early December. And so the next one is coming up on June 30th of 2025. So it's a little ways away, but I was suggesting that everybody just mark that, vertical price line on your chart and put an alert on it so that you know that that's a very high probability weekly trend change point.
Well, that's interesting how it lines up similar to some of the dates that you were talking about with bonds. Generally when crude oil rallies, it puts pressure on bonds and they sell off because it's so important when it comes to inflation. But another market that's kind of been interesting on that inflation related front has been gold, which is hitting new all-time highs today, just absolutely exploding higher. What's your take on gold? What are your price targets? And on the geocosmic front, what are you looking at happening here?
Yeah, well, my price targets on gold are 29.21 and 30.48. And that was definitely one that I was looking at buying off the lows back in, back in December. And here we are. Actually was that low actually came in back in November the week of November 13th was the 20-week cycle low, but then it was in December that I picked gold up again.
Yeah, secondary low. Yeah.
Yeah. The secondary low. Right now, what I have a weekly pivot coming in potentially this week on gold, but that since we just broke to new all-time highs, the alternative scenario, basically I have two possible scenarios right now for gold. We're either going to find a weekly pivot high this week, or we will be looking for a weekly pivot high the week of February 24th, plus or minus 1 week. And in both those scenarios, I look for some weekly consolidation that will be 2 to 3 weeks in length, and then followed by another rally. But whether that rally breaks to new highs or not is kind of undecided. I have the 20-week cycle coming in due on April 10th on gold for the low. So we're approaching we're in the second half of that cycle.
Yeah.
So I'm certainly not suggesting anyone buy gold right this moment because we're breaking up.
Well, I would say one of the most fascinating things that I've been watching over the last couple of weeks in gold is how it's just blown through a handful of Jupiter aspects. I mean, you had Sun trine Jupiter, you had Jupiter direct yesterday, you had a couple weeks ago Venus square Jupiter, and normally one of the things that we've noticed here is that whenever you have Jupiter signatures, gold doesn't do as well. It does respond well to Neptune. We did just have Venus conjunct Neptune, and we just hit a new all-time high. So Neptune usually good, Jupiter not so good. But when you have a market that is doing something bullish during a bearish aspect, usually it means it's even more bullish. So I think that speaks a lot to what's happening in gold. But just to pivot slightly over to silver, we have not made a new high yet in silver. I'd be really interested to see if we can take out this high from October of 2024. If we do, I think hold on to your horses. You could really see silver make an impressive run. So I don't know if you had anything you wanted to share on silver, but it has lagged. It's kind of typical of it to do that. But we know that once silver starts to run, it really can run.
Yeah, well, I have had an upside target of around 37.50 on silver. Certainly, I think this is a really key level here, this 33.93, because if we were to fail at that level, that could set up kind of a monthly head and shoulders style
Yeah.
pattern.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily my bias. It's just worth noting, you know. I definitely am looking for a potential retest of the highs. I have the same pivots coming in on silver. It's not always that way, but right now in my cycle measurements, I have the exact same scenario for silver, which is either a pivot high this week. And, you know, as far as like a setup goes, if we were to get that pivot high this week, I like that best if we were going to have a buying opportunity. If we don't get a pivot high until towards the end of February, then I'm a little bit more cautious on a weekly buy the dip kind of scenario. But overall, my strategy in gold and silver has just been a buy the dip kind of scenario. You know,
that's what we do in bull trends, right?
yeah, yeah.
Okay, we're going to talk about the market that everyone loves to cover, and I want to talk about Ethereum too. But let's start off with Bitcoin. Um, kind of a snooze fest here. You know, you have all these headlines coming out of the new presidential administration that you would think would move this, but we're getting late in the cycle. It's holding above support. It's below resistance. To me, it just seems like it's running out the clock. Now, one of the things that I've commented on before is how Bitcoin tends to like Venus in Taurus, while Ethereum likes Venus in Libra, which is kind of cool because Venus rules both of those signs. But, you know, we were talking about Venus retrograde just a moment ago. And normally, if we weren't going into Venus retrograde, we would have Venus in Taurus sooner. But now we have to wait a little bit longer for Venus to get into Taurus for Bitcoin's sake here. That being said, Mars is still in Cancer. We've seen some big moves happen with the planet in that sign. But what are you looking at with Bitcoin here? We are at the lows of the day right now, but nothing nothing really moving like we saw on Monday just yet.
Yeah, well, there's been quite a bit I've been tracking on Bitcoin, specifically from the heliocentric perspective. Last week, we had the heliocentric Mars-Pluto opposition, and that has a very distinct correlation. It's like a 100% correlation to down moves on Bitcoin for 3 to 26 days.
Okay.
And so I initially thought maybe we had fulfilled it quickly with that kind of dump and pump last week, but now we've continued down, and so clearly we're in that longer time window for that Mars-Pluto opposition reaction. The week of February 19th is the heliocentric Mercury ingress Aries, and in the Bitcoin markets, that has a very specific effect on. It causes weekly trend changes. Well, I don't know if it's correlated to weekly trend changes, an overwhelming majority of the time. And of course, when you're trading in a range, it's a little bit trickier. So the ideal setup would be that we would be near the high or the low of the range in the week of February 19th. The other thing I'm tracking too is this full moon is going to be in Leo. And Bitcoin, from a geocentric perspective, just on the moon cycles, has a pretty strong correlation with daily trend changes for people who are trading the daily swings or the intraday swings on Bitcoin. Daily trend changes correlate to the moon transiting through both Aquarius and Leo.
All right. Very good to know. Let's wrap it up with Ethereum here because this one really moved this week. We had quite a sell-off, but by the end of the day on Monday in the cash market, it actually closed up positive. From that low, it rallied over 34, almost 35%. So quite the volatility here. We had talked about some intermediate term cycles before. We are 16 months from that October 2023 low in Ethereum. So I'm looking at some decent opportunities here. Now, I would like to see a little bit more of a positive response, but I mentioned just a little bit ago how Venus in Libra is generally liked by Ethereum, but we're going to have right now we have Venus in Aries, and we're going to have that retrograde motion. So I wonder how that's going to impact Ethereum since it's the opposite sign from Libra. But what are you looking at in Ethereum here? And did we see the low?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think my answer to that would be that it's kind of the line in the sand, right? If we lose that level, that 2111 level, then I don't think that doesn't look good for Ethereum.
Yeah.
But if we hold that level, then it's entirely possible that the range on Ethereum continues actually, because it's a pretty wide range actually. So we could certainly tighten up a little longer on Ethereum.
Great. Well, Margo, that's all the time that we have for today. Thank you so much for joining me. Where can our viewers find you and your work?
Yeah, I have a website, margoamala.com. I do personalized readings there, and you can book them there. I also have a Discord community and a Patreon where I put out a bi-weekly newsletter that focuses on market timing. And then you can follow me on Twitter at Margo Amala.
Awesome.
I also have a YouTube channel as well, so make sure to check out my YouTube channel.
Great. Great. Thanks, Margo. And for those that read the monthly cycles report, stay tuned for the latest edition that's going to be released on Monday and Tuesday. We're going to update our outlook on stocks, bonds, commodities, currencies, and more. We also have some exciting announcements coming down the pipeline in terms of the start of the Merriman Market Timing Academy this fall. We have the MMA Tech Report written by MMTA graduate Vipka Held that's going to start being published this month, so stay tuned for that. And if you want an opportunity to meet the crew of the MMA analysts, we will all be getting together at the Cosmic Convergence Conference in Orlando, Florida on March 7th through March 9th. So check that out. It's going to be a great conference with some of the classical astrologers in the community. You don't want to miss that. And plus, who doesn't love some warm weather in the winter? So Margo, are you going to make it down to Florida?
I am. Yeah, I have my tickets and everything. I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. Well, it's going to be good to connect with you again. So looking forward to that. And thanks again for joining me.
Okay. Bye.